The sponsor of this video is ashesandarchives.com. I have to admit, working on this was really tough for me. Not just because of all the research that I had to make, but emotionally too. The Siege of Leningrad is one of the darkest moments in human history. Even now, I can't fully grasp how the city managed to survive. What kind of strength those people had to keep fighting through starvation, freezing cold and constant bombing. The siege lasted 872 days, from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944. It was one of the longest and most devastating blockades in modern warfare. If we look at the three most famous sieges in history, there's the legendary Siege of Troy, made famous in Homer's Iliad, then the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, and then there's the Siege of Leningrad, unique in one key way. It was the only major city in history to endure such a long, brutal siege and still never surrender, despite unimaginable suffering and loss. Sometimes in movies or books, you might hear that the siege lasted 900 days. Well, that's just a rounded number. Some sources say 882 days, but honestly the exact count doesn't really matter. The battle for Leningrad lasted from 1941 to 1944, and throughout those years the city fought, resisted and struggled to survive. Modern estimates say that between 1.1 to 1.3 million civilians died during the siege, most of them from hunger and cold. Just to put that into perspective, that's 10 times more deaths than the Hiroshima bombing and roughly equal to the total number of American soldiers killed in every war the US fought from its founding up until 1991. This is the first video in a series about Siege of Leningrad. Today we're going to dive into the historical context that led to the siege, how the war unfolded, why Leningrad became a key target, and the events that set the stage for one of the longest and most brutal blockades in history. Before the war, Leningrad wasn't just the second most important city in the Soviet Union. It was a city full of symbolism. It was the birthplace of the October Revolution and former capital of the Russian Empire. This was where in 1917 the Soviet state was born. The famous call, "Workers of the world, unite," first ran out here, and from this city Bolshevik power spread across the country. For the Soviet government, Leningrad wasn't just a city. It was a living symbol of revolution and communism's victory. But beyond politics, Leningrad was also a massive industrial powerhouse, producing 12% of the entire Soviet Union's industrial output. The city was home to key military factories, including the Kirov machine building plant, which made the powerful KV heavy tanks a crucial weapon in defending the city. Even during the siege, Leningrad's factories continued to produce tanks, artillery, mortars, machine guns and ammunition, over 100 different types of weapons in total. Losing this industrial power would have been a devastating blow to the Soviet war effort. Hitler was obsessed with capturing Leningrad. In the original Operation Barbarossa plan, it was an even bigger priority than taking Moscow. Controlling the city meant controlling the entire Baltic coastline and wiping out the Soviet Baltic Fleet. On top of that, Leningrad wasn't just a city. It was known as the cradle of the revolution, just like I said earlier in this video. The birthplace of Soviet power. Taking it would have been a massive propaganda victory and a huge blow to Soviet morale. And from a military perspective, if Germans captured Leningrad, they could free up a huge number of troops to push harder towards Moscow. Hitler was so confident in a quick victory that in the summer of 1941, before German troops even reached Leningrad, he ordered invitations to be printed for a victory ball at the luxurious Astoria Hotel in the city center. According to German plans, Leningrad was supposed to fall by September 1941. The task of capturing Leningrad was given to Army Group North, led by Ritter von Leeb. His forces were massive, about 500,000 soldiers, all gathered in East Prussia near the Lithuanian border, ready to push deep into Soviet territory. The army was made up of around 30 divisions, including 6 high-mobile tank and motorized divisions. They had everything they needed for a fast and brutal offensive. Roughly 1,500 tanks, 12,000 heavy weapons including powerful anti-aircraft guns, and an air fleet of nearly 1,000 planes. Their mission was clear: First, they needed to crush Soviet resistance in the Baltic region. Then, they had to neutralize the Soviet naval base in Kronstadt, which was a key stronghold. And after that, the ultimate goal was to capture Leningrad and cut it off completely. But they weren't doing it alone. Part of the plan was to link up with the Finnish army to tighten up the noose around the city. The Germans had a strategy to trap Soviet forces west of the Dwina river, forcing them into a corner and wiping them out. The German advance was unbelievably fast. By the 10th of July, they had already stormed through the cities of Ostrov and Pskov, barely slowing down as they pushed forward. The tank divisions were moving at an incredible speed. By early July, they had already covered 2/3 of the distance to Leningrad, with only about 300 kilometers left to go. At that speed, it seemed like nothing could stop them. Just over a month later, by the 16th of August, they had reached Novgorod. Despite the rapid progress of the German offensive, several key decisions made by the High Command significantly slowed down their final push toward Leningrad. One of the most questionable moves was the decision to divert the 39th Tank Corps from the Army Group Center to the area around Luga. From a logistical standpoint, this choice made little sense. The corps had to cover grueling 450 kilometers over rough, broken roads of the northwest, while the distance to Moscow, the primary target of Army Group Center, was only about 350 kilometers and along much better roads. Because of this costly detour, the corps didn't reach its destination until the 24th of August, critically slowing the German advance at the moment when the speed was everything. The second major mistake was spreading their forces too thin. Instead of focusing all of their strength on a direct assault of Leningrad, instead of concentrating their available forces in one powerful strike, the German command decided to break through the Luga defensive line from 3 different directions all at once. The 41st Tank Corps was ordered to advance north from the bridgehead near Kingisepp. The 56th Tank Corps was sent northeast from Luga, while the 1st and 28th Infantry Corps moved parallel to the Volkhov River in a northern direction. This division of forces weakened the impact of each individual attack, giving Soviet defenders precious time to reinforce their defensive lines around the city. These strategic miscalculations, perhaps driven by the German High Command's overconfidence in a swift victory, played a decisive role in the failure of their blitzkrieg against Leningrad. And in doing so, they gave the city the crucial time it needed to prepare for the fight. The Soviet defense near Luga was nothing short of heroic, and played a crucial role in slowing the German advance. Fierce battles raged all along the front, and of all the German forces, only the 31st Panzer Corps advancing near Kingisepp managed to take any real progress. By the 20th of August, these corps, reinforced by the 8th Panzer Division and supported by the 18th Army, had managed to isolate the main Soviet forces in the Luga operational group. Nearly 30,000 Soviet troops were trapped, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. The remaining Soviet defenders included 9 divisions, one of them an armored unit. By that point, after weeks of relentless combat, these divisions had been so badly weakened that most had been reduced to the size of a regiment, barely more than 3,000 soldiers each. The intensity of fighting had been devastating. Despite facing superior firepower and overwhelming numbers, the Soviet forces near Luga refused to back down. Their stubborn resistance significantly delayed the German push toward Leningrad, giving the city's defenders precious time necessary to prepare for the siege that was soon to come. The siege of Leningrad lasted for nearly 2.5 years, from early September in 1941 up until late January in 1944. But this wasn't just a military operation, it was a carefully planned act of genocide designed by the top leaders of Nazi Germany. Historical records make it painfully clear mass starvation in Leningrad wasn't just a tragic consequence of war. It was deliberate. The goal was to wipe the city off the map and erase its people entirely. The Nazis had their sights on the destruction of Leningrad long before the siege even began. In early July of 1941, just weeks after launching the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler made his intentions very clear in a meeting with Germany's High Command. He stated, without hesitation, that he was determined to level both Moscow and Leningrad to the ground, so there would be no need to worry about feeding their populations during the winter. By late September, those plans had been officially set into motion. A directive from the German Navy High Command laid out the future of Leningrad in chillingly direct terms. The document stated that once Soviet Russia was defeated, Leningrad, or Petersburg, as the Germans still called it, would be of no further interest. The city, it declared, would be surrounded, shelled relentlessly by artillery, and bombed into oblivion from the air. Perhaps the most horrifying part was the final instruction. If the city's leaders ever attempted to surrender, the Germans would not accept their request. The plan was not to conquer Leningrad, it was to destroy it along with everyone inside. In the fall of 1941, Hitler issued yet another brutal order. Any refugees trying to flee Leningrad would not be allowed through German lines. Instead, they were to be forced back into the starving city. Historian Nikita Lomagin explains that the Nazi leadership saw no reason to storm Leningrad. Doing so would cost German lives, but all at the same time, they refused to accept the surrender because that would mean taking responsibility for feeding civilians. German soldiers were given direct, strict instructions. If anyone tried to escape, whether it was women, the elderly, or even children, they were to be stopped, first with warning shots. If that didn't work, they were to be killed on sight. Leningrad was no longer just a besieged city. It had been turned into a massive concentration camp where over 1 million people were left to die from hunger and freezing temperatures. The siege of Leningrad was never just about military tactics. It was genocide through starvation from the very start. A modern Russian investigation confirms that this was part of Hitler's larger plan for so-called war of extermination against the Soviet Union. More than 75 years later, in the fall of 2022, the St. Petersburg City Court officially ruled that the siege was not just a tragic chapter of war, but a war crime and a crime against humanity. The court recognized it as an act of genocide against the people of the Soviet Union. During the hearings, prosecutor Viktor Melnik argued that the true death toll was far higher than the officially recorded 649,000. According to more recent estimates, at least 1,093,000 people lost their lives during the siege, most of them to hunger and brutal cold. As German forces closed in on Leningrad from the south and west, Finnish troops advanced from the north. But instead of pushing forward, they stopped at the old Soviet-Finnish border from 1939, just about 30 kilometers from the city. This was not a tactical decision, it was personal. Marshal Carl Gustav Mannerheim, the commander of the Finnish forces, made the call himself despite repeated pressure from Hitler to continue the attack. There were several reasons behind Mannerheim's decision. He had spent many years living in St. Petersburg and had a deep connection to the city, filled with memories of a different time. Beyond sentiment, he also knew that storming a heavily fortified city would lead to enormous Finnish casualties, something he had no interest in risking. According to legend, the decision may have shaped Finland's future after the war. Some say that Joseph Stalin, recognizing Finland's refusal to attack Leningrad, chose not to force the country into the Soviet bloc as a form of reward. Whether true or not, Finland remained one of the few nations bordering the USSR that managed to stay independent. On the 8th of September 1941, the fate of Leningrad was sealed. German forces captured Schlisserburg, cutting off the city's last remaining land route to the rest of the Soviet Union. From that moment on, Leningrad was completely encircled. That same day, the first major bombings began. One of the first targets was the Badaev warehouses, where much of the city's food supply was stored. On the 8th and 10th of September, German bombers set the warehouses ablaze. More than 40 storage buildings burned for days. Thousands of tons of flour and sugar went up in flames. For the people of Leningrad, watching those fires was like seeing their own future burn before their eyes. Hunger was coming, and there would be no escape. But the truth is, even if the warehouses had not been bombed, the supplies inside would have lasted only a few weeks at most. The city was already facing a food crisis. It was only a matter of time before starvation took hold. This was the beginning of the siege. Nearly 3 million people were now trapped inside Leningrad, cut off from the world. Many of them would not survive the years ahead. The horrors of the blockade were only just beginning. This is just one of several videos about the Siege of Leningrad. There's so much more to uncover, stories of suffering, resilience, and survival. Stay tuned as we continue to explore one of the darkest chapters of the Second World War.